The Brollys. Old Puff and Blow. One night, Harry was lying in his bed, trying to get to sleep. As usual, he had his cuddly toys, Hippo and the elephant with him, and Snake was by the door. On the wall above his bed was a wooden weather house. This was the home of Harry's friends, Mr. and Mrs. Brolly. When the weather was fine, Mrs. Brolly came through one of the brightly coloured doors. When the weather was wet, Mr. Brolly came out. Harry was almost asleep when a gust of wind blew him into the weather house.
"There you are,"
said Mr. Brolly.
"I thought a good puff of wind would bring you. I do believe it's the only way to get anywhere at all."
Harry smiled to think of everyone going about in this manner.
One could get oneself blown to China if one wished.
The wind put Harry down by Mr. Brolly's computer screen. Then the door opened and in marched Mrs. Brolly. "Brolly," she said, "I never heard such rubbish. You may make a nice little wind for kite flying." She took Harry's hand and led him out into the garden. "But I haven't brought my kite," said Harry. Mrs. Brolly opened her bag. Inside was a big coloured kite. "Quick, open your umbrella and off we go." So Harry opened his duck's head umbrella. As he floated up, he grabbed hold of Hippo's ear, and to his surprise, she rose from the path as light as a balloon. Snake held on to Elephant's tail, and the little bird flew by their side. "Where are we going?" shouted Harry. "You'll see," said Mrs. Brolly. Suddenly, below them was a park with high railings and a gate. So Mrs. Brolly, Harry, and the animals landed softly on the grass. It was the ideal place for kite flying. Harry looked round. There was something not quite right. The animals and the little bird were going to sleep. "Mrs. Brolly," said Harry, "what's wrong with the park?" "Children should sometimes find things out for themselves," said Mrs. Brolly. So Harry set off down the path. He had not gone far when he realized that nothing in the park was moving. Then he turned a bend in the path and saw 3 children. "There's no wind to fly our kites," they said. "I'm sorry," said Harry. "There's nothing I can do." He turned and trotted off down the path. Behind him, he heard the patter of children's feet. By and by, he came back to where Miss Brolly sat sewing. The animals still lay sleeping in the grass. "There's no wind," said Harry. "The children can't fly their kites." "Well, it's all Brolly's fault," said Mrs. Brolly. As she spoke, Harry saw Mr. Brolly coming down the path.
"Where there's no wind,"
said Mr. Brolly,
"there's no fun, no hustle and bustle."
"Make a wind at once," said Mrs. Brolly, "so that the children can fly their kites."
"But what will move a kite will move other things," said Mr. Brolly.
The leaves of the trees began to rustle, and the blades of grass began to stir. The children smiled as their kites rose into the air. Hippo and Elephant awoke. The little bird flew round in circles, and Snake came down from the tree. In the bandstand, the band began to play.
"Isn't it wonderful?"
said Mr. Brolly.
"And all because of my old friend the wind. Old Puff and Blow, I call him. Old Blow all before me."
Mr. Brolly was so excited that he began to whistle. "Brolly," said Mrs. Brolly in a warning voice, but it was too late. The wind blew strong, and up went the children. They held tight to the strings of their kites. Hippo and Elephant too were swept up by the wind.
"It's especially nice for a large animal to fly,"
said Mr. Brolly. He began to whistle more loudly. The wind snatched the instruments from the bandsman's hands. Over the treetops they flew. The bandsmen followed their instruments. Each man held onto the boot of the man in front. Snake flew behind them as straight as an arrow.
"Isn't it wonderful?"
cried Mr. Brolly. But Mrs. Brolly didn't move in the wind at all.
"There are other kinds of winds,"
said Mr. Brolly.
"There's one which blows houses around. Shall we try it?"
"No," said Mrs. Brolly. "People wouldn't like their houses being blown around."
"I thought it might be like living on a merry-go-round,"
said Mr. Brolly. "Stop the wind," said Harry. "Put everything back where it was." He clung tightly to a post as the wind tossed it up and down.
"My boy," said Mr. Brolly, "nothing can be put back exactly where it was."
He seemed quite happy until Mrs. Brolly appeared at his side. At once, the wind began to die down. Gently, everything and everyone came down to earth. The bandsmen landed in a heap on the grass with their instruments. Hippo came down in the pond, where she felt quite at home. But she astonished a water boatman. He turned and hurried back to his home in the reeds. Snake fell on the gardener's shed and slid down the drain pipe. Elephant came down on the bandstand and fell through the roof. He flattened it completely and was rather surprised at first. But all in all, Mr. Brolly had been right. Elephant had enjoyed his flight. The children, now safely on the ground, smiled happily. "What are their names, Mrs. Brolly?" asked Harry. But Mrs. Brolly was already floating away, holding her umbrella. "They don't have names," she said, as she floated upwards. "They are just a dream." "They are not a dream," cried Harry. "They are real children like me," shouted Harry after her.
"Of course they are,"
said Mr. Brolly, appearing at Harry's side. But when Harry turned to look, the children were nowhere to be seen. "Come back," he shouted. And with that, he awoke in his bed. Looking through the window, Harry saw a crowd of children flying kites. "Mrs. Brolly, I'm going to fly my kite," said Harry. But Mrs. Brolly was just a little figure made of wood, standing in the doorway of the weather house.